Where do you find God? Almost sounds like a loaded question, doesn't it? I mean, if God was someone you could find, wouldn't everyone be out searching? Well, rather than looking for something elusive, like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I reckon it's more about learning to recognise the way God is already present to us in our everyday lives. I'm Lizzie Oakes, and this is Where Do You Find God? My guest on the podcast today is Dunedin-born author Jennifer Andrews. As a child, Jennifer spent time living in France, kicking off a lifelong love affair with the country, and throughout her life she became an avid walker. In 2020, at the age of 48, Jennifer was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson. Since then, she's walked a number of pilgrimages, written a number of books, her latest titled The Only Way Is Up, On Foot to Rome, which documents walking just under 2,500 kilometres from Canterbury to Rome. The book is a memoir of long-distance walking, but also a meditation on how we move forward when life asks us to begin again. Jennifer, welcome to Where Do You Find God?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I know you've completed a number of these pilgrimages. Your latest, the Via, you pronounce it better than me.
Via Francigena.
Yeah. So how many of these larger, long-distance walks have you done to date?
So I've done 4 so far and another one on the agenda coming up.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. About 5,500 kilometres.
Wow.
So, yeah, a long way across, I think, 5 different countries so far in about 4 different languages. So, yeah, love it. Addicted.
You must have gone through quite a few pairs of shoes.
Quite a few pair of shoes, actually. A couple of different models for various reasons. But, yeah, I counted up recently and I think it's 6 pairs so far of my current favourite that works for me.
Yeah.
A lot of soles worn through.
Yeah. A lot of souls worn through, and I imagine it's something that really impacts your soul, these walks.
It does. Yeah, in every sense of the word, absolutely.
Yeah. Jennifer, in Acts chapter 17, verse 27, it says, God intended that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So my question for you today, Jennifer, is where do you find God?
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose one of the things that's great about walking is that you get so much reflection time. I mean, that is definitely one of the reasons that I walk. And I think for me is, how I would perhaps describe where I find God and how I find God. I grew up going to church and I have, to that extent, a religious background. I sang in choirs, both in the Anglican faith and also in the Presbyterian church as a child and young adult. But I don't consider myself religious in the purest sense of the word. And I definitely don't feel like I walk for pure religious reasons, but I definitely feel like there's a spiritual element to the walking, and something which has probably developed over time. It's not necessarily, I didn't necessarily start out that way on my first pilgrimage. In fact, I felt a little bit like an imposter because I'd been thinking about doing a pilgrimage for a while, but I kind of just didn't feel like I had a reason to do it. What's my, everybody's got a reason, and I don't have one.
Yeah.
And then it was a bit of a case of, be careful what you wish for, because then I was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's and I thought, well, hello, there's my cause. Yeah. And so I set off walking and really, yeah, it's a physical exercise. And I thought of it, like most people, as very much a physical exercise at the start, but it became clear to me that it was so much more, including that spiritual dimension. And so over time, and increasingly with the longer walks, particularly the Via Francigena, I have found it a very spiritual experience.
Tell me about that.
Oh, yeah. So over time, in the course of the pilgrimages I've done, I've found that you get into a zone when you're walking for a long period of time, multiple days back to back. In the case of the Via Francigena, 100 days of walking. You know, everything else drops away. You know, so kind of like, I mean, I think of people talk about the pilgrimage in thirds. You know, there's a physical stage, there's a mental stage, and then people talk about the spiritual stage. And I definitely find that, yeah, in the first week or so, you know, you're kind of, you're walking and it just feels like a long hike and, you know, then maybe like a walking holiday. And then you get beyond that and it feels hard. You know, you're actually, my body is hurting. Why am I doing this? It's a bit grim. And then once that all drops away and the kind of stresses and strains of what you thought was important in daily life and all the minutiae of admin drops away, you get to this kind of zone, which I call the pilgrim zone, and you really drop in behind your own thoughts to the kind of resourcefulness and the clarity that sits behind that. Everything becomes deeper and more existential, and the conversations that you have and the experiences you have and the meaning that you derive from things becomes deeper and deeply philosophical. And I've found that really insightful because, as I say, I wouldn't consider, I'm quite a pragmatic person. I wouldn't consider myself deeply religious or spiritual, but I have found and did find, particularly on the Via Francigena, in that last kind of stage, perhaps kind of like 4 to 6 weeks of walking in Italy, into Rome, approaching St. Peter's, all of those footsteps behind me, step after step, one foot in front of the other. It's a rhythm, you know, you get into this rhythm and it's almost like faith is that rhythm of putting one step in front of the other rather than the destination. It's a really interesting exercise.
As you just said, faith is putting one step in front of the other. I mean, how is your walking impacted by your early onset Parkinson?
It is in the sense that, I mean, I live and work and walk with that condition. I mean, I personally, it's typically called a disease, and I deliberately call it a condition, not because that changes the diagnosis or the outcome necessarily, but it changes the way that I think about it, and therefore I manage it. So I prefer to think of it as a condition, much like diabetes or something like that, that I have to manage and live with, rather than something which is going to, kill me.
Yeah, no, I like that. That makes sense.
It's not. You lose that fatalistic dimension. It's actually I can do something about it.
Yeah.
And so, very much. On a practical level, that is why I walk. I walk because I can. And while I can, I will. And while I will, I can. For me, it's kind of self-fulfilling. And that quickly became evident to me. It is exercise and walking, seemingly in particular, is one thing that everybody can kind of agree on, may very well help and certainly doesn't hurt you when you've got this sort of condition. And everybody's got 2 legs, and most people can put 1 foot in front of the other, even if it's slow. And I thought, well, I'll just do that, and I like to do that anyway. And so I walk with it, and I figure, the longer I walk, the longer I'll walk. So I keep going while I can keep going.
Just circling back to something you said before about sort of the last 4 to 6 weeks of this latest long distance walk, and you sort of said it was almost like, as you were describing it, I was just saying that it was almost like a clear space. You got past your thoughts, and like you said, you were just in this space, and it felt spiritual. If you think about being in those moments and those weeks and that space sort of beyond yourself, how do you think about where God was there in that moment with you?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple of things. For me, the way I think about, God is really, I suppose, where is God for me? And thinking about God kind of reflects for me our search for meaning. And the incredible insight that I had on this trip on the Via Francigena, which I hadn't really thought about before in that respect is that actually God is within me, not without. And that kind of came to a head when I arrived at a hostel in northern Italy, having already walked for, I don't know, something like 2,000 kilometres. And we arrived in this hostel and we're having this conversation. It was a little hostel, just a day's walk ahead of Lucca in Italy, kind of in northern Tuscany. The Hospitalero volunteer hosts were saying to me, that there are 99 churches in Lucca, you must go visit them. And without really thinking, I said, what happened to the 100th church? And quick as a flash, he looked at me and he said to me, you are the 100th church. And I was just floored. I thought, wow. And the light bulb dawned and I thought, wow, that is so powerful. Like, I am the 100th church. I carry the light within me. I don't find the light. I don't find God without. Actually, God is within me. The light is within me. I carry everything within me that I need to live. And I probably, and I'm still thinking about it now, right? But I definitely, it infused all my thinking from that point on in the kilometres to Rome, such that, I found when I arrived in St. Peter's Square, amidst all these tourists, I just had this incredible lightness of being. It was just, I wanted to bottle it. I took my shoes off and, which I'd worn for 1,200 kilometres, and they were pretty rank and ready to come off. And I took them off and I stood barefoot on the grey, warm cobbles of St. Peter's Square. And I just felt, this incredible lightness while the sense of being grounded. And I found that incredibly freeing. And it kind of came together at the same time with another pilgrim that we'd met from Sweden, a lovely pastor called Pelle, who we kind of intersected with over the last kind of 4 to 6 weeks and had lots of conversations with. And he gave me and my walking buddy on the sort of second to last night a little round stone memento of our walk that he'd found on the path, and he'd annotated it with Matthew 5:14, I am the light of the world. And it was just, it's become really meaningful to me. And that is for me an example of, I suppose, where I find God in those kind of insights on the road.
Yeah. Jennifer Andrews, thank you so much for joining me today on Where Do You Find God?
Thank you.
Tune in every Wednesday afternoon at 4:30 on Sanctuary, or listen and subscribe via your favourite podcast platform and give us a review so others can find us.